Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to bring a review to you of a lens that is no longer new, but in some cases, some of the significant catalog lenses of various brands. I like to go back and to give them kind of my in-depth definitive review, mostly because I'm curious about how they stand up. And in this case, this is a lens that, though it was released in 2019, I believe, it still holds up very, very well by my testing standards in 2022. And that is the Sony E-mount 70-350mm F4.5-6.3 G OSS lens. This, along with the, I believe, 16-55mm F2.8, is the only two lenses I'm aware of that are APS-C specific, designed by Sony, but carry both the G branding and some of the more premium features that come with that. In many ways, this lens is a little bit more like some of the lenses I'm accustomed to testing on Fuji, where Fuji, because they are locked into the APS-C platform, they tend to put a little bit more of their premium features into APS-C lenses because that's what they're doing. And Sony has done that here and has really produced a top-notch lens, basically in every metric. It's a lens that I think, as I noted, it's held up really well, but I think it is, if you're going to talk about, you shoot APS-C, you have a telephoto need, this is pretty much a must-own in that category, and I'll detail why as a part of this review here today. First of all, however, a word from our sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist, modern wallet that sets you free from a bulky traditional wallet while also making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. Visit phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber. You can even customize your wallet with new accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even the Chipolo tracking integration if you're the kind of person who loses their wallet. Use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out. So we have a lens here that, while not compact, is certainly compact when you compare it to full frame equivalents. Remember that this is a lens that has a focal range from a full frame equivalent of 105 millimeters all the way out to 525 millimeters. And so you're talking about a significant zoom range. And if I compare it to a lens like my 200 to 600 millimeter G lens for full frame, you can see that all of a sudden this is looking remarkably compact. It is 77 millimeters in diameter and 142 millimeters in length, though it will extend out to a total of 190 millimeters when it is fully zoomed out to 350 millimeters. As you can see, it does come with a lens hood, and the lens hood is actually relatively compact. And I noted that while the Fuji 70-300 millimeter, which I happen to be testing at the same time, while it is a little bit shorter in length with everything fully retracted, if you add on the Fuji lens hood, and certainly if you extend things, then the Fuji is the longer lens by a fairly good margin. And so this is a lens that, while it's not as compact to begin with, it doesn't grow as significantly, nor is the lens hood add on as much bulk or length to the lens as what some competing lenses might. The lens weighs in at 625 grams, so a moderate weight that I think most people are going to be able to carry all day without too much concerns. And certainly, about half the weight, if not more of full frame equivalent type lenses. Now, because it carries a G brand, that means that it comes with more features than what you're going to typically see on an APS-C lens. That includes the focus hold button here, an AF/MF switch, along with an on and off for the OSS. But more importantly, I would say even than those, is that internally you've got a full body of weather sealing from the lens mount all the way through seal at the various rings and ports, about 10 different seal points. And so this is a thoroughly sealed lens, which makes it more of a professional grade lens for, real world performance. Now, interestingly, inside, the blade count is only 7. And as you can see here, while that does retain a circular aperture shape when you stop down a stop or two, when you get it on down, it is going to show you, that hexagonal type shape. And so, it's a little bit lower than their typical 9 and even higher blade count, but gets the job done. Another interesting feature here is the minimum focus distance of the lens. You can focus down to 1.1 meters, 110 centimeters, a little over 3.5 feet, and you get a effective but not, chart-topping 0.23 times magnification. Certainly going to be very useful in a lot of situations, but it's not like these, pseudo macro performances I've seen from some other type lenses that fall in this category. Now, I do want to take a moment to talk about the optical stabilizer in this lens, which is really, really effective. I was able to hand hold this shot just inside at about 1/6 of a second at 350 millimeters, which, if you do the math, works out to about 6 full stops of stabilization. And that was shooting on the A6400, which does not have in-body image stabilization. So all of that is coming specifically from the lens. And I will say on that note that, frankly, I have yet to see a major difference with a lens that has in-body image a lens that has stabilization. When you add it to a lens with our camera with IBIS, I've yet to see much of a significant difference between having a camera without IBIS and a camera with IBIS. I think the IBIS is more handy on lenses that are not stabilized on their own than in some kind of hybrid situation where you're somehow getting a little bit of assistance from both. In my real world experience, it really does not make much of a difference. So we'll talk about a little bit more in our wrap-up. When it comes to price, this is priced in the U.S. market at right under $1,000 U.S. But I did note that as I looked at some other markets, including here in Canada, the U.K., Europe, places like that, that this lens actually fares better in those markets, where a lot of times the price point really goes up from the U.S. Market price. It's not really true. In this case, I can get this lens for the same price Canadian dollars, which makes it a relative value, because typically I'm used to seeing a 30 to 35% premium over a U.S. price here in Canada. In the UK, you're down in the 600 or 700 pound range. So, a nice drop rather than that being basically at par, as it so often is. So this is a lens I think that becomes more of a value relative to the competition in some of these other markets that you might be located in. Another nice aspect of being a G lens is that this has been equipped with a higher end XD linear motor, which is something that we're more typically see on the better full frame lenses. And a byproduct of that is that you've got lots of focus speed, you've got very quiet and focus, and beyond that, you have got the ability to really keep up with action. And so I noted in particular that, there are limitations here. The limitations, though, however, are tied really into the camera body, in that, Sony has yet to release an APS-C specific camera body that is really a sports-oriented camera. And I'd really love to see them do that. And so to kind of get the best performance, I threw it onto my Alpha 1 in an APS-C mode. I, cranked out a burst that I think that had 170 something frames in it. And I counted throughout that as I tracked mallards flying, birds in flight, that I think there was 2 or 3 dropped frames out of all of that. And so it was really successfully keeping up and locking focus, even as the lighting changed a little bit as I panned across their action up against the sky. And so it really was effective in that. For the most part, it was effective on whatever camera I used when it came to tracking IAF, though I did have one situation where Loki was behind some of the rails on my porch, and on the A6400, it was just a little less intuitive in seeing beyond the rails and grabbing the eye, and I had to manually put a focus point over there to get the focus that I wanted, and when it did achieve it, it was, of course, very good focus. That's really my only complaint. Whatever body that I was using, I was able to, really dial in very tight, effective focus and get really well focused results throughout my test. And so very high marks for that. I also noted that it was quiet and smooth for doing focus pulls. There is some focus breathing, as you can see there, but not necessarily extreme either. And so all good really to report on the autofocus front. This is a lens that's been given premium parts, and frankly, it shows. It's as quiet, as effective as any of the full frame equivalents that I have used. And so kudos to them on that front as well. So let's break down the optical properties of this lens. A quick look at the MTF charts shows that this is a lens that should perform really, really well. And so we'll dive in and see if that bears up in real-world testing. So we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. The first thing I will point out is because this is a first-party lens, the corrections do a really great job. Profiles are excellent. So there's a good chance you'll never see this pincushion distortion that I'm showing you here right now unless you purposely disable those corrections, which I have for this test. So there definitely is some pretty noticeable pincushion distortion that is there that, again, will get covered up by the profile. But basically what you're going to find is that as you progress through the zoom range, that the pincushion distortion gradually diminishes while the vignette gradually increases. Fortunately, we don't start with much vignette to begin with. And so if we go to my manual correction here, you can see that I've had to do a fairly significant -13 correction for the distortion, but only a +15 for the vignette, which is a really minuscule amount. And so as you progress throughout the zoom range by 350 millimeters, this figure drops to a -7, so not as pronounced, while this figure down here grows up to about a +37. But when it comes to the vignette, that's always really, really minor along the way. So, not great marks for distortion, but very high marks when it comes to vignette. You can tell from the MTFs that this is a lens with very good contrast, and often that points to a successful control of, chromatic aberrations. And so in this case, even at a 200% magnification, you can see that in this very high contrast subject, and so we've got a dark background, just kind of the green of probably evergreens behind it, but then this kind of dried weed that's left over from last fall, you can just see that there is really no fringing to be seen in any portion here, either before or after the plane of focus. We've got a lot of defocused objects down here, and you just can't see the fringing. So a really strong performance there. Likewise, when it comes to lateral chromatic aberrations, which show up along the edge of the frame, and they would be really, really manifest in a shot like this, where there's a lot of bare branches, so really hard, harsh transition from the bright sky behind to the branches. And you can see, again, even at 200% magnification, just really not anything to see here, and so a great control of aberrations. So typically that's going to point to a fairly high performance optically when it comes to sharpness and contrast, and that's certainly what we're going to see here. Now, my chart tests are done on the A6400, so that's 24 megapixels, and again, I'm showing you a 200% magnification, so none of the flaws are hidden. But really, there's no flaws to be seen here. You can see that resolution and contrast in the center of the frame are excellent. And then I think even more impressive is that as you begin to move off axis, that I think that the mid frame here looks every bit as good as what the center did. Contrast is fantastic. And even if you move down into the corner here, you can see that contrast and detail is really, really popping. Very, very well done. And if we pop up to the opposite corner, we can see an excellent centering to where both corners look fantastic. Now, another interesting trend that I saw in the MTF chart that does hold up in real-world testing is that it didn't show much improvement when you stopped it down. The lens was pretty close to optimal performance wide open. And what I do see is an ever so slightly increase of contrast and, so a minor improvement there to where there's just maybe a little bit more pop on the texture. You can see just the darks here are a little bit darker looking. But other than that, very, very little difference. And so that's good news. And because, this is not like a super fast lens in terms of maximum aperture. And so you can see that you're going to get, pretty well peak performance right from wide open. Now, this is a variable aperture zoom, so it means not only does the maximum aperture vary, but the minimum aperture varies. So at the wide end, with the biggest maximum aperture of f4.5, minimum is f22. We get down to f6.3 at the telephoto end, and that translates to an f32 minimum aperture. I will point out, though, as per usual, that you're going to want to avoid those small apertures because of the cost of diffraction, which, as you can see, even comparing wide open to minimum, or maximum stopping down, you're just going to see that, a lot of that contrast has been robbed, and it really softens the image, kind of like a smear of Vaseline been put over the image frame. And so just avoid those throughout the zoom range. Now, by 100 millimeters, or near 2, as we can see here, the maximum aperture has closed to f5. And so we can see you've lost a third stop. You can see that everything looks excellent in the center of the frame. In this case, that stop down to f5.6 does give you a little bit more of an uptick in terms of contrast and resolution. A little bit more valuable here, but as I move off center, I don't see the effects as pronounced. And so again, you're still getting a very strong performance right out to the edge of the frame, even from wide open. Now, 135 millimeters is the next marked point on the zoom barrel. Now our maximum aperture has closed to f5.6. We can see that, if anything, our performance is higher still, and so wide open at f5.6. The center looks really fantastic. The mid frame looks really fantastic. You can see stopping down to f6.3, a very, very minor uptick in contrast, but very little. We wouldn't see it. Let's just put it this way: you wouldn't see it unless it was side by side. But it's just a really fantastic performance wide open. Stopping on down to f8, and really, again, there's not a whole lot extra there. You're just getting great performance wide open. Now, by 200 millimeters, we've closed to our smallest maximum aperture of f6.3. That's where it'll remain throughout. We can see, though, again, a fantastic performance at at 200 millimeters. It is just incredibly sharp. Stopping on down to f8, I see a tiny bit more contrast, but frankly, you're getting about as much as you're going to get out of the lens at f6.3 with just a minor uptick in contrast. And so a really excellent performance. And as we've seen thus far, a really even performance. Looking up here again, we can see that our centering remains excellent throughout the zoom range. Now, lesser zoom telephoto lenses, really blow it when it comes to their extremes. So particularly at the telephoto end, that's just not the case here, though. And while it's not maybe at its top level of performance, it's very close to it still. You can see at f8 there is again a minor uptick in contrast. Maybe a little bit more pronounced a difference in terms of improvement of contrast, which the MTF does suggest. But overall here, we have got a really excellent performance. I think the further you get towards the edge of the frame, the more improvement you get in contrast, by stopping down a bit. But this is a fantastic performance wide open. Now, I did have some people ask me back when I reviewed Tamron's new 18-300 millimeter, which, I praise for being very strong for having such a big zoom range. And so they wondered how it compared to a lens like this. Well, the truth of the matter is that a lens like this that has a dedicated telephoto range is almost always going to best a lens that also tries to cover wide angle. And we can see here that while the Tamron is still credible at 300 millimeters, it's not in the same class as the 70-350 millimeter, and that's at its best in the center. As we move off towards the mid frame, you can see that gap increases more. It's probably more pronounced at mid-frame than it is in the corner, but there's just no question that the Tamron is not in the same class optically as what this lens is. Though again, I stand by my observation that it is quite good for a lens that covers such a huge zoom range, but it's not in the class as this dedicated telephoto zoom. So how good is that out in the real world? Well, I mean, if you zoom into a pixel level at 100% magnification, that looks fantastically sharp. Tight detail there. Here, a little bit closer look at Loki cuddled up under a blanket, looking very cute there. But if we zoom in here to a pixel level, you can see just, even indoors in a not less than optimal light, you've just got amazing detail that is rendered there. This is a very strong lens. Now, sometimes when you get a lens that has very good sharpness and contrast, it gives you a negative effect on the bokeh. I think that Sony has mostly avoided that here, though. While we have, crisp result there, the background here looks nice and smooth. And of course, a long focal length like this allows you to really just, crush backgrounds in optimal conditions like we've got here, where everything is just completely blurred out. But I found that even if I added some complication here, like I think this lens looks good, maybe a little bit of nervousness in this area, but, throughout this more complex scene, it's actually handled quite well. The detail looks wonderful there at the point of focus. Here's another image where, again, you've got closer layers here, but I think that they've been handled quite well. Our detail looks good, in our area of focus, but our defocused area also is holding up quite well without any kind of issue. This was an image that I thought really was pretty close to a worst case scenario. It's a really busy environment, and my distance to the subject was fairly long, and then the distance to the background wasn't as long. So there's just a lot of potential for nervousness, and it's not to say that it's completely not there. There is a few points that are a little bit busy. Subject isolation isn't going to be off the charts with a slower zoom lens like this, but at the same time, I think that the image has been handled really well. So I give this lens quite good marks for its bokeh, even though it's obviously not going to replace a high-end telephoto prime with a larger maximum aperture.
I basically only have one optical criticism of any significance, and that is that when I did put the sun right in the frame, which frankly is harder to do with a telephoto lens because the angle of view is narrow, but I did see some definite ghosting artifacts here, some generalized veiling wide open. If I stopped the lens down, we can see that this pattern gets a little bit more pronounced. Contrast is a little bit better, but overall, this is not necessarily a strength for the lens. So, I mean, it's pretty easy to not point it at the sun in a situation like this, and so I would avoid doing that.
So I think it's safe to say that this is a lens that really holds up to modern testing. A very, very consistent and stable optical performance throughout there. And really the only metric I have any kind of complaint about optically is the fact that it does, show some flare artifacts. Though that becomes less relevant with telephoto lenses because frankly, it's less often that you have the sun in the frame because your angle of view tends to be so much tighter. And so, not maybe a huge concern on that front either. It could have maybe used with a little bit deeper lens hood, but really for the amount of times that the sun's going to be in the frame, I think I'll be satisfied with a more compact lens hood, that makes it a little smaller in terms of its profile and smaller for storing. Yes, it does have some pincushion distortion, but as I noted, it has first-party correction support, and unless you intentionally go to look at those, you're really never going to see them. And so great sharpness and contrast, low aberrations, good bokeh. Really, what more could you ask for? So at the end of the day, if you are an APS-C shooter and you need a telephoto lens, you shoot Sony E-mount, this is a no-brainer. There's also an interesting option for those of you that shoot with the higher resolution full frame bodies and you're interested in bringing along a telephoto, but you don't want to carry a big and heavy lens. Because frankly, this is a lens that, if you're shooting on, say, you have a Sony a7R4, well, you've got 28 megapixels of resolution in APS-C mode. That's more than what you get in this a6400. That makes it a really tempting option to bring along because it's plenty of resolution. And even on my Alpha 1, it's still plenty of resolution there, and a byproduct of that is that this is a lens that I find to be a very attractive option. Maybe even if you're wanting to go out and have a telephoto option, even if you're a landscape photographer and you want some of those long shots, this is a much more convenient lens to bring into the field. And so I think this is a lens that has some interesting applications for a variety of different photographers. And though the price point is not cheap for it, I do think that this is a lens whose performance warrants its price. If you want more information, you can check out my written review, which is linked in the description down below. There's also linked to an image gallery if you want to see more photos that I've taken with the lens. Beyond that, there are buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, links to follow myself or Craig on social media, or to check out our new channel, Let the Light In TV. Beyond that, you can become a patron, you can purchase channel merchandise, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.